5, a 51-year-old murder mystery solved. Today, the Cobb County District Attorney revealed the name of the man who kidnapped, raped, and killed a 9-year-old girl in 1972.
On the afternoon of the 13th of January, 1972, 9-year-old Debbie Lynn Randall left her family's apartment in Marietta, Georgia, to visit a playground not far from home. Before leaving, her mother asked her to stop by a nearby laundromat and pick up a box of detergent on her way back. Hours passed with no sign of her return, and fear quickly began to grip her family as they feared the worst. For the next 2 weeks, search teams and investigators worked tirelessly to find the missing little girl. The search eventually led to a heartbreaking discovery. Debbie's lifeless body was found deep in a wooded area, far from the familiar surroundings of her home. Despite detectives working tirelessly on the case, the mystery surrounding her death remained unsolved for decades, but eventually, the truth would be revealed more than 50 years later. What happened during Debbie's 5-minute walk home? How did a child disappear without a trace in a quiet neighborhood? And how did a single strand of hair ultimately uncover her killer after 5 decades? Hi, and welcome back to Cold Crimes Exposed. Today's case takes us to Marietta, Georgia, a suburban community where children rode their bicycles until sunset, and parents rarely worried about them playing outside. Neighbors knew one another by name, doors were often left unlocked, and serious crime felt like something that happened somewhere else. It was the kind of place where families felt safe, the kind of place where a child could walk home alone without anyone thinking twice. For 9-year-old Debbie Lynn Randall, it was a wonderful place to grow up. Born on the 21st of August 1962, Debbie was the youngest child of John and Juanita Randall. She was known throughout the neighborhood for her bright smile, gentle nature, and cheerful personality. Friends remembered her as a kind-hearted little girl who loved spending time outdoors and could easily make people laugh. Whether she was playing with dolls, riding her bike, or running around with neighborhood children, Debbie seemed to carry an endless supply of energy wherever she went. Thursday, the 13th of January, 1972, seemed like an ordinary winter day in Marietta, Georgia. Families were settling into their evening routines, children were playing outside, and nothing suggested that tragedy was only moments away. Around 4:30 p.m., 9-year-old Debbie Randall asked her mother, Juanita, for permission to go to a nearby playground where neighborhood children often gathered after school. The playground was only a short walk from home, and in a community where neighbors knew one another, it felt perfectly safe. Before Debbie left, Juanita gave her a simple errand. The family needed washing powder, and there was a laundromat across the street from the playground. Debbie could pick it up on her way home for dinner. It was an ordinary request, the kind of small responsibility children completed every day without a second thought. Debbie happily agreed, put on her coat, and headed out the door. For the next few hours, nothing appeared unusual. Children played, cars passed through the neighborhood, and residents went about their evening. As the winter sun began to set, Debbie left the playground and stopped at the laundromat. She purchased the washing powder. Then she started the short walk home. The distance was small. Just a few minutes separated Debbie from the safety of her front door. She knew the route well and had traveled it many times before. But this time, she never arrived. As darkness settled over Marietta, Juanita expected to hear her daughter come through the door. Dinner was nearly ready. Debbie had always been responsible about coming home on time. Minutes passed, then more minutes. Concern slowly turned into fear. Debbie was a responsible child. Maybe she had stayed at the playground longer than planned. Maybe she had stopped to talk with a friend. Maybe she had simply lost track of time. But as the minutes stretched on, those comforting explanations began to fall apart. Something was wrong. John and Juanita Randall stepped out into the neighborhood and began searching the streets Debbie knew so well. They called her name along the route she should have taken. They checked the playground. They knocked on nearby doors. They asked neighbors if anyone had seen their little girl. No one had answers. Then came the discovery that changed everything. Near the roadside, someone found the box of washing powder Debbie had been sent to buy. She had completed the errand. She had been on her way home. And somewhere between the laundromat and the safety of her own front door, Debbie had vanished. The fear inside the Randall home turned into panic. Friends, relatives, and neighbors poured into the streets. Flashlights cut through the darkness as searchers moved through yards, alleys, vacant lots, and wooded areas near the family's home. People called Debbie's name again and again, hoping that somewhere in the cold night, a frightened little voice would answer. Among them was Debbie's older brother, Marvin. Terrified but determined, he went door to door, asking the same heartbreaking question over and over. "Have you seen Debbie?" Some residents remembered seeing her earlier that afternoon. Some had noticed her near the playground. Others remembered the small girl carrying the box of washing powder. But after that, the trail went silent. No one saw who approached her. No one saw where she went. No one saw the moment she disappeared. Later that night, police officially launched a missing child investigation. Officers began interviewing witnesses, retracing Debbie's final known movements, and searching every area where a child might have wandered, hidden, or been taken. By the next morning, the search had grown far beyond the Randall family. Hundreds of volunteers arrived, then hundreds became thousands. Church groups, students, local businesses, civic organizations, police officers, and ordinary residents joined together with one desperate purpose: bring Debbie home. Search lines stretched across open fields. Volunteers pushed through thick brush, walked along creeks, checked abandoned buildings, and searched construction sites. Some carried flashlights, others carried photographs of Debbie. Flyers appeared across Marietta as investigators begged for one useful tip, one clear witness, one detail that could point them in the right direction. Within days, nearly 4,000 people had joined the effort. And still, they found nothing. No sign of Debbie. With each passing day, hope became harder to hold. Parents in Marietta began pulling their children indoors before dark. Doors that once stayed unlocked were now bolted shut. A town that had believed itself safe suddenly felt watched, vulnerable, and afraid. And as the search entered its second week, one terrible question hung over everyone. If 4,000 people could not find one little girl, what had really happened to Debbie Randall? Then, on the 29th of January, 1972, 16 agonizing days after Debbie vanished, the search finally came to an end. A group of dedicated students from Southern Tech, who had volunteered tirelessly alongside police, made the heartbreaking discovery. While combing through a heavily wooded area off Johnson Ferry Road, roughly on the other side of the woods from the Randall neighborhood, they stumbled upon a small, partially unclothed body hidden among the trees and underbrush. It was Debbie. The scene painted a horrifying picture of her final moments. Her body showed clear signs of a fierce struggle, as if the brave 9-year-old had fought with every ounce of strength she possessed. Investigators believed her own coat had been used to muffle her desperate cries for help. She had been assaulted and ultimately strangled. The once vibrant little girl who had left home full of laughter now lay lifeless in the cold forest, far from the safety of her family's arms. The news spread through Marietta with shocking speed. The community that had spent more than 2 weeks praying for a miracle was suddenly forced to confront its worst fear. Debbie Randall was not coming home. For 16 days, her family had held on to hope. In a single heartbreaking moment, that hope was gone. The search was over. But the hunt for the person responsible was only beginning. The discovery of Debbie Randall's body ended the search for a missing child, but it opened something even darker. Now, investigators were no longer trying to find Debbie. They were trying to find the person who had taken her. The murder of a 9-year-old girl shattered Marietta. For more than 2 weeks, thousands of people had searched fields, woods, roadsides, and abandoned places, praying she would be found alive. Now those same people were forced to accept that someone had stolen a child from a familiar neighborhood in broad daylight and somehow left almost no trace. Parents were terrified, neighbors were suspicious, and one question spread quietly through the community. Was the killer still among them? Detectives launched a full homicide investigation. They returned to the playground. They revisited the laundromat. They walked the same short route Debbie should have taken home. Every house nearby became important. Every parked car mattered. Every stranger seen in the area suddenly seemed worth remembering. Witnesses were interviewed, then interviewed again. Officers knocked on doors, searched for suspicious vehicles, and tried to rebuild Debbie's final movements minute by minute. They needed one person who had seen something, one description, one license plate, one detail that could turn the case in a real direction. But the killer had left behind silence. Hundreds of tips poured into the police department. Some people reported strange men, others remembered unfamiliar cars. Some believed they had seen Debbie earlier that day. Every lead was followed, every possibility was checked, and one by one, they fell apart. No witness had seen the abduction. No one could identify the attacker. No one knew where Debbie had been taken. The person responsible seemed to have disappeared as completely as Debbie had. As weeks turned into months, investigators faced a chilling reality. They were hunting a killer without a face, without a name, and without a clear path to follow. But buried inside the evidence from the case was one tiny clue. At the time, it seemed almost useless. A single unidentified hair. It did not belong to Debbie. Investigators believed it may have come from the person who killed her. But in 1972, that meant almost nothing. DNA testing did not exist. There was no genetic database, no forensic genealogy, no way to take one strand of hair and turn it into a name. To most people, it was just a fragile piece of evidence, too small to solve anything, too silent to speak. But someone preserved it. That decision would become one of the most important choices in the entire investigation. The hair was sealed away with the rest of the case materials, stored in an evidence box, while the world changed around it. Years passed. Detectives retired. New investigators took over. Old reports were opened again and again. Leads were chased, rechecked, and exhausted. Still, the case refused to die. For decades, Debbie's killer remained unknown. No arrest came, no confession surfaced, no witness stepped forward with the answer everyone needed, but the truth had not vanished. It was waiting. Inside an evidence box, a tiny strand of hair sat quietly for nearly 50 years, and one day, science would finally give it a voice. As the years slowly turned into decades, Debbie Randall's murder became one of Georgia's oldest unsolved child homicide cases. The massive search effort that had once united thousands of people gradually faded into memory. Newspaper headlines disappeared. Television crews moved on to other stories. New crimes captured public attention, and a new generation grew up without knowing Debbie's name. But for her family, the case never truly ended. Every birthday served as a reminder of the life Debbie never had the chance to live. Every holiday left an empty space that could never be filled. Family photographs documented the passing years, yet they also highlighted the absence of the little girl whose smile had once brightened every room she entered. While the world moved forward, the Randall family remained trapped in the shadow of the 13th of January, 1972. Debbie's mother, Juanita, carried that pain for the rest of her life. Friends later recalled that she never stopped talking about her daughter. No matter how many years passed, the loss remained just as painful. The unanswered questions haunted her. She wanted to know who had taken her child, why it had happened, and whether justice would ever come. Her husband, John, carried the burden in his own way. Though he tried to remain strong, those closest to him understood that the tragedy had permanently changed him. Like Juanita, he continued hoping that one day, investigators would uncover the truth. Meanwhile, detectives refused to completely abandon the case. Over the years, different investigators inherited the file. Each one reviewed the evidence, studied witness statements, and searched for something previous detectives might have overlooked. Advances in forensic science created moments of optimism, but each new possibility eventually led to another dead end. The case seemed frozen in time. Then, decades after Debbie's murder, an unexpected witness came forward. A woman named Sandra Walker contacted investigators with a memory she had carried since childhood. At the time Debbie disappeared, Sandra had been a young girl living in the neighborhood. For years, she remained uncertain about what she had seen and questioned whether her memory was even important. Eventually, she decided to speak. According to Sandra, she remembered seeing a young girl who appeared frightened being forced into a pickup truck on the afternoon Debbie vanished. She recalled hearing screams and witnessing what looked like a struggle before the vehicle drove away. The account immediately caught investigators' attention. Could this be the missing piece that had eluded detectives for decades? The information renewed interest in the case and generated fresh hope that answers might finally be within reach. But despite the significance of Sandra's statement, investigators would soon discover that the breakthrough they had been waiting for was not coming from a witness. It was coming from a tiny piece of evidence that had been sitting silently in storage for nearly half a century, waiting for science to catch up. For nearly half a century, Debbie Lynn Randall's murder remained one of Georgia's most haunting unsolved crimes. Detectives had followed hundreds of leads, Witnesses had been interviewed. Searches had been conducted. New investigators had inherited the case and reviewed every available report. Yet despite decades of effort, the identity of the person responsible remained hidden. Many cold cases eventually reach a point where investigators simply run out of options. Debbie's case appeared to be heading in that direction. But while the investigation seemed frozen in time, something remarkable was happening elsewhere. Science was evolving. During the early 2000s and 2010s, advances in DNA technology began transforming criminal investigations across the United States. Cases that had once seemed impossible to solve were suddenly producing answers. Evidence that had sat untouched in storage for decades was being re-examined using techniques investigators in the 1970s could never have imagined. Then came one of the biggest breakthroughs of all: forensic genetic genealogy. The revolutionary technique gained national attention after helping investigators identify suspects in several notorious cold cases. Instead of searching for a direct DNA match in criminal databases, scientists could compare an unknown DNA profile to people who had voluntarily submitted their genetic information to public genealogy databases. Even distant relatives could provide clues that allowed investigators to build enormous family trees and gradually narrow their search. For cold case detectives, it was a game changer. And in 2019, investigators decided it was finally time to apply that technology to Debbie Randall's case. The key was the tiny strand of hair that had been preserved decades earlier. For years, it had been little more than a piece of evidence sitting quietly inside a storage box. Detectives had always believed it might belong to Debbie's killer, but there had never been a way to prove it. Now there was. Forensic specialists carefully extracted DNA from the decades-old evidence. The process was delicate and far from guaranteed. Time, contamination, and degradation could easily destroy valuable genetic material. After nearly 50 years, investigators knew there was a real possibility that the evidence might yield nothing at all. Months passed as scientists worked to recover a usable profile. Then came the breakthrough. A genetic profile was successfully developed from the evidence. For the first time since Debbie's murder, investigators possessed something they had never had before: a biological pathway leading toward the killer. The DNA profile was submitted for genealogical analysis, and researchers began the painstaking process of tracing family connections. The work was incredibly complex. Investigators examined distant cousins, great-grandparents, marriage records, census documents, birth certificates, and countless other historical records. Family branches stretched across generations. Thousands of names were reviewed. Slowly, the enormous pool of possibilities began shrinking. Months of research eventually led investigators toward a particular family line. Then, the focus narrowed further. One individual began standing out from everyone else. His name was William B. Rose. The discovery immediately caught investigators' attention. Rose had been 24 years old when Debbie disappeared in January 1972. More importantly, he had lived in the same apartment complex as the Randall family. He was familiar with the neighborhood, familiar with the residents, and likely familiar with the routines of the children who lived there. The deeper investigators dug, the more troubling the picture became. For the first time in nearly 50 years, they believed they had finally identified the man responsible for abducting and murdering Debbie Randall. But just as the investigation seemed to be reaching its conclusion, detectives encountered a shocking twist. William Rose was no longer alive. In 1974, only 2 years after Debbie's murder, he had died by suicide. The revelation stunned investigators. After spending decades searching for a living suspect, they had finally found a name, only to discover that the man had been dead for almost half a century. Yet detectives were not prepared to close the case based solely on circumstantial evidence and genealogical research. After 50 years, Debbie's family deserved certainty, and obtaining that certainty would require one final and extraordinary step. By 2023, investigators believed they had finally solved the mystery that had haunted Marietta for more than 50 years. The DNA evidence, genealogical research, and decades of investigative work all pointed toward one man, William B. Rose. But belief was not enough. After half a century of unanswered questions, detectives understood that any announcement would be scrutinized by the public, the media, and most importantly, Debbie Randall's surviving family members. They needed evidence that would eliminate every remaining doubt. The genealogical evidence was powerful, but investigators wanted something stronger. They wanted direct confirmation. There was only one way to obtain it. Working with Rose's surviving relatives and securing the necessary legal approvals, investigators prepared for an extraordinary step that few could have imagined when Debbie disappeared in 1972. They would exhume William Rose's remains. Nearly 49 years after his death, Rose's grave was opened so forensic experts could collect a direct DNA sample. It was a remarkable moment. The investigation had spanned multiple generations of detectives, prosecutors, forensic scientists, and family members. What had begun with volunteers carrying flashlights through dark woods in 1972 had now evolved into a case driven by advanced genetic technology and modern forensic science. Everything now depended on one final comparison. Forensic laboratories carefully analyzed the DNA recovered from Rose's remains. Scientists then compared that profile to the genetic evidence connected to Debbie Randall's murder. Investigators waited. So did Debbie's surviving relatives. For more than 50 years, the case had existed in a painful state of uncertainty. Now, for the first time, there was a real possibility that the mystery was about to end. Then the results arrived. The DNA match was conclusive. William B. Rose was identified as the man responsible for the abduction and murder of Debbie Randall. After 51 years, investigators finally had the answer they had been searching for. For the detectives who had spent years working the case, the announcement was both satisfying and heartbreaking. One of Georgia's oldest unsolved child murder investigations had finally been solved. The evidence was clear. The mystery was over. But the victory carried an unavoidable sadness. Rose had died decades earlier. There would be no arrest, no courtroom, no trial. No opportunity for Debbie's family to look the killer in the eye and hear a guilty verdict. Justice, in the traditional sense, would never come. Yet the significance of the breakthrough could not be denied. A little girl who vanished while carrying a box of washing powder was no longer just a photograph in an old case file. Her story had not been forgotten. The people who searched for her had not been forgotten. And after more than half a century of silence, the truth had finally emerged from the shadows. For the first time since the 13th of January 1972, investigators could close the file, knowing exactly who had taken Debbie Randall from her family, and exactly how long it had taken to bring that secret into the light. For more than half a century, Debbie Randall's family lived with a question that seemed destined to remain unanswered forever. A little girl left home for a short walk, carrying a simple box of washing powder, and never came back. The person responsible escaped justice, and as the years passed, many feared the truth had been lost forever. But Debbie's story reminds us that some cases are never truly forgotten, because one detective chose to preserve a tiny strand of hair, because investigators refused to close the file, because science continued to advance, and because people never stopped searching for answers. The truth finally emerged after 51 long years. William Rose would never stand trial. He would never hear a guilty verdict. Yet his name is now forever linked to the crime he tried to take to the grave. Debbie Randall was only 9 years old when her life was stolen, but her story ultimately helped prove an important lesson. Time can hide the truth, but it cannot always erase it. If this story moved you, please consider liking this video, subscribing to the channel, and sharing it with others. Every share helps keep the stories of forgotten victims alive and ensures that, like Debbie, they are never truly forgotten.